Are we ready to start?
Yes. So, good evening, all. I am Raval, and I am a moderator for this session 3, titled Mexico Cartels, Synthetic Drug Revolution, and Globalization of Narcotics. It is my privilege to welcome you this session focusing on Mexico Cartels, Synthetic Drug Revolution, and Globalization of Narcotics. This discussion builds directly on the themes of evolving drug economies and transnational networks highlighted earlier, but shifts our attention to the one of the most dynamic and rapidly transforming theaters in the global narcotic landscape. Mexico today sits at the center of a profound structural shift in the drug trade, from plant-based narcotics to highly potent synthetic drugs such as meth and fentanyl. This transformation has fundamentally altered the economics of trafficking. Production is faster, cheaper, less geographically constrained, and significantly more lethal. As a result, cartels are no longer just trafficking organizations, they are vertically integrated, technologically adaptive entities operating across continents. What makes the Mexican case particularly critical is the evolution of cartels into quasi-state actors. In several regions, they exert territorial control, challenge state authority, and deploy sophisticated violence as a tool of governance and market regulation. Their operations now extend far beyond the Americas, linking supply chains across Asia, distribution networks in Europe, and financial systems that span multiple jurisdictions. Equally concerning is the convergence of organized crime with global illicit financial systems. The rise of synthetic drugs has been accompanied by new laundering mechanisms, ranging from trade-based money laundering to the use of cryptocurrencies and digital platforms, further complicating detection and enforcement. Today's session will unpack the rise of synthetic drugs and the transformations of the global drug economy, the structure, strategy, and evolution of Mexican cartels as transnational actors, the internationalizations of trafficking networks and their implications for global security, policy responses, including successes, limitations, and lessons from enforcement strategies. As we engage with this perspective, it is essential to recognize that Mexico is not an isolated case. It is a critical node in a rapidly globalizing narcotics ecosystem that demands coordinated, multidimensional response. I look forward to an insightful and substantive discussion. So, the first speaker of this session is Dr. Barry Zulauf. Dr. Barry is a Georgetown University professor of applied intelligence. He is an intelligence professional and academician with expertise in analysis standards, national security, and policy, experienced in leadership, strategy, and teaching in the intelligence field. He has vast professional experience in the field of security and conflict. He is going to speak on the topic Understanding US Approach to Counter Narco-Terrorism from Mexico, Success, Failures, and Lessons. Dr. Barry, the stage is all yours, sir.
Well, thank you very much. First, I need to say I do not speak for the President of the United States or for the Department of Defense. I don't speak for the Defense Intelligence Agency or for the Drug Enforcement Administration, all places which I've worked in the past. My lawyers tell me I need to make it clear that I am a retired intelligence community executive, and I'm speaking to you in my capacity as a Georgetown University professor. However, I'll be as forthright in sharing perspectives with you as I can. And I'm hoping that we can have some conversation if there's really only three speakers. The approach that I want to give you is that the United States has changed its approach to dealing with the cartels, with counter narcotics, with international organized crime. It's a relatively recent change that's taken place, and I will tell you why. I served for 40 years and 3 months in the federal government, much of that in either law enforcement counter-narcotics or defense counter-narcotics. And until relatively recently, my country and the organizations that deal with the problem saw counter-narcotics as just a law enforcement issue. that narcotics were illegal. They were approached from law enforcement perspectives or border control perspectives. That's the way that we approached the issue. There was some cooperation between the intelligence community and the law enforcement community on this issue, some assistance on the part of the Department of Defense, but it was near each other like this. What's happened is all of those organizations, all of those missions have now been, I believe, fully integrated to deal with these issues. It used to be in the old days when we dealt with heroin smuggled out of Afghanistan into Europe, or cocaine smuggled out of South America into the United States, that was a law enforcement interdiction problem. We did know all these many years that there were connections, and some speakers from the previous panel talked about this, to terrorism. In particular, for many, many years, DEA, my former organization, followed Osama bin Laden and his own personal connections, his own personal ownership of loads of drugs that were being smuggled out of Afghanistan. We knew that drug money was going to fund terrorist organizations, but that was a secondary factor. What we've seen now, especially with the rise of synthetic opioids being smuggled into the United States and increasingly elsewhere, coming primarily from cartels in Mexico, and the source of supply of the precursor chemicals coming from mostly China, and with respect to my hosts, somewhat from India as well, is that this formerly law enforcement problem now constitutes a national security threat, at least in the view of the United States, far more serious than Afghan heroin ever was, far more serious than, in my view, far more serious than Salafi terrorism, or I'm not sure what the term of art there is, Islamist terrorism, Salafi terrorism, far more dangerous in terms of loss of life on a continual basis than that ever was. Law enforcement organizations in the United States, not just the Drug Enforcement Administration, where I spent many years lastly as a deputy chief of intelligence there, but others, Customs, Border Protection, FBI, Homeland Security, were until very recently, as I said, mainly concerned with enforcing the drug laws of the United States. They hadn't until recently been obligated to cooperate closely in a strategic campaign run from the top of the government on down, is a strategic campaign to not just arrest and prosecute traffickers and seize drugs, but as our president, the current president, says, to eliminate the cartels, eradicate the membership of the cartels who now pose a foreign terrorist threat to the United States. The synthetic opioids that are now being smuggled out of Mexico by the cartels are seen by the current administration as requiring closer cooperation than ever before between defense and law enforcement. And I would suggest, I'm only suggesting at this point, that our partner nations, some of them have already started to do this, but partner nations should approach this as well. A direct, strategic, planned cooperation between all the levers of government, defense, intelligence, law enforcement, diplomacy, economics, because that's the nature of the threat, and nothing else is going to be able to deal with this terrorist threat. We see in the United States the agencies, including law enforcement, including defense, including intelligence, are attempting to address these challenges in dealing with the trafficking of illicit drugs, in particular fentanyl and other forms of synthetic opioids as a threat to security. So I do want to mention, and I think some of you have talked before about fentanyl itself, but I just want to make sure that it's understood the degree of damage that goes on now with fentanyl. The annual deaths from opioids in the mid 2020s were approaching 100,000 a year. That's a 9/11. Someone can do the math. A 9/11 every couple of weeks. That's the scale of death that comes into the United States, and it has a similar proportion in other countries as well. This administration, and again, I don't speak for the president, but this is an observation, has been dealing with our southwest border, which was the significant weakness, shutting down what had been millions of people crossing the southwest border unchecked. Many of them, not all, many of them bringing drugs, including fentanyl and other synthetic opioids with them, down to the point where we are dealing, even on a bad day, with single digits crossing the border. Most days, zero illicit crossings of the southwest border. And that comes from cooperation between defense, law enforcement, intelligence, and a clear directive and policy from on top. So that's what can be done. And then I would quote the Director of National Intelligence in public testimony just a few weeks ago said that the deaths have now gone down to 38,000. That's more than a 50% drop in the death and destruction over the past approximately year. That's a testament to what can be done. That's on the short term. The long term, again, I mentioned before that the cartels, those organizations are really the target. Not so much the particular drugs, whether it's heroin or cocaine or meth or fentanyl, but the organizations should be the target. The cartels have long been in a standoff, I would call it, with the Mexican state. On paper, the Mexican state is a strong unitary state, but in reality, it's relatively weak. I'm not saying it's a failed state or even quite yet a failing state, but it is not strong enough to impose its will on every square hectare of Mexican territory. That enables, I think, what one of the previous speakers in the previous panel said, the ability of the cartels in many ways to function as the local governments. They don't do this, however, with a political agenda. They don't want to overthrow the Mexican regime, much the opposite. They're very happy with it being there. And in order to hold the regime at bay, at arm's length, so that the cartels can continue to do their business, smuggling death and destruction into the United States, they corrupt, they threaten, they use outrageous violence as a means of communication to other criminal organizations and to the authorities. But they do not want the burden of government for themselves. That's a distinction between these criminal organizations, which we are now calling foreign terrorist organizations, yes, but they don't have a political agenda. They don't want to overthrow the current political order. Instead, what they want to do is maintain the corruptible government that allows them to continue to pursue their profitable drug trade. Nor do they want to overthrow the United States. Much the opposite. They want us in other consumer markets. They want us to buy their drugs. They want to make money from us. Now, why do we think that we need to call them foreign terrorist organizations? Because we're looking at the combination of traditional 70-decade-long patterns of drug trafficking from the cartels in Mexico with this unprecedentedly lethal drug, fentanyl, and other synthetic opioids, together with the connection of precursor chemicals coming from China. That poses a national security threat to the United States. That is a weapon of mass destruction brought into the United States from a foreign power. That's why we need to deal with it that way. And other countries around the world need to be thinking about it that way. I don't know so much about the Indian government, but I know that several other European governments and North American governments are thinking about this the same way and creating a fentanyl czar at the very top of the government in the Prime Minister's office to start doing what we in the United States have done, pull together all the levers of power. The Canadians have done this. I don't know if there's any Canadians with us today. The Italians have done this. There is a fentanyl czar in the Italian Prime Minister's office. I had a brief conversation with him a while back, and he said, "We don't have a fentanyl problem in Italy yet. We don't want one. We see what fentanyl has done to you in the United States, and we want to prevent that." Here's one thing that we have not yet seen from the cartels, and this is my own personal nightmare. We in the United States haven't seen the cartels visit the same kind of violence inside the United States or against American citizens or American interests as the cartels have been able to visit in Mexico, using outrageous forms of violence, publicly, filming executions. Someone mentioned that, hanging people upside down from bridges. They haven't done that in the United States yet. They haven't had to, because we haven't been putting the pressure on them. And I don't want to see that be visited on our allied partners in Europe or elsewhere in North America or in South Asia, any place else. I don't want to see that. I'm hoping to see a future where we can return what the trafficking organizations do to a level where we can think about them, or start to think about them again, as just law enforcement. I'm not saying that heroin is a good thing or cocaine is a good thing or anything like that. Far from it. But if we could return to the old days when we did not have this witch's brew combination of violence, cartels, trafficking, synthetic opioids, and Chinese precursor chemicals, and I have to say a little bit Indian precursor chemicals, that would be a good approach to be able to go to. So what do we have? What challenges do we face in order to be able to do that? Counter-drug intelligence efforts in this environment face some challenges in dealing with narco-terrorists, because we've gone beyond law enforcement. We're now into gray zone conflict, not quite open-armed conflict, not quite warfare, but we're in the gray zone that makes the challenge of interagency cooperation, international cooperation, a little bit more challenging. One of these is access to information. There still are technical and cultural and bureaucratic reasons why organizations, even in my country, in the United States, despite clear direction from the president to share information with one another. Who has the right to US person information? Who has the right to highly classified intelligence information? How can we move that around? We're starting to build structures in my country to be able to find safe places to share information so that it can be used both on the intelligence side and on the law enforcement side. The new Trump administration has put relatively new administration has put a high priority on this. Previous speaker also mentioned the complexity of drug trafficking networks and their flexibility. I won't spend a lot of time on this, therefore, but they are hierarchical in nature, these trafficking organizations. And as such, at first glance, they look like terrorist organizations. They have a hierarchy, they have a cell structure, they have a boss at the top. But they're more intricately woven together. They're decentralized and more flexible as a result. They can move the way that they smuggle their products across borders in order to react to our enforcement efforts. They have very strong intelligence operations and counterintelligence operations on their own. They have the ability to react in some ways more rapidly than we can, and they understand the seams between jurisdiction of individual organizations. They understand that an international border is often a seam between various enforcement organizations, and they're very good at working in those seam areas to get between enforcement operations or international cooperation. The traffickers have demonstrated how adaptable they are, and they have moved in the past from marijuana, where a Sinaloa cartel started 70 years ago, meth, cocaine, heroin, and now fentanyl. They will do whatever makes them money. This is another distinction between the trafficking organizations and terrorists. They're in it to make money. They will continue to carry out an operation so long as the cost is down here below the profit that they can make. As long as they can make money from markets by selling fentanyl, and in some cases their profit margin is probably 80–90%. It's tremendously profitable to them. They're not going to change. So what we have to do as organizations is cooperate together and figure out how to raise the cost. And that comes from destroying drug boats, that comes from seizing money, that comes from shutting down labs, that comes also from arresting people, but not just that. We need to raise the cost, and we need to somehow lower the profitability. When that switches, when it costs them more than they're making in profit, they will stop that particular product. They'll go do something else. That's the way to approach the organization itself. We don't know, at least I don't know, maybe someone else can share, where is that line? We don't know entirely how the cartels figure out what their profit and cost calculus is. So the last thing I would mention in terms of a challenge is we need to continue and improve human intelligence inside these organizations. Now, I just said they're violent. They use violence to communicate. They use violence to discipline their organization. Asking someone to penetrate a drug cartel is a very, very risky proposition, but we need to get better understanding of the culture inside those organizations, how they decide, to be able to get an assessment of where the pressure points are as we can raise the cost and lower the profit. So I want to say just a couple words about the cartels. Again, are not terrorist organizations, despite the fact that we in the U.S. have called them that. They are foreign terrorist organizations legally, but there's some differences from plain vanilla terrorist organizations. The terrorist organizations do need money, but not a lot of money, and that's not their purpose. Someone told me that the estimates are that the 9/11 attacks on the United States cost about $500,000, relatively low cost to carry out those activities. The drug cartels make trillions of dollars, far more money, and that's the goal. They're in it to make money. The terrorist organizations only want enough money to be able to carry out their terrorist acts. And the violence that the foreign terrorist organizations do, like Sinaloa or Tren de Aragua, is for the purpose of facilitating their business. It doesn't have a political agenda, at least not yet. It doesn't have a political agenda aims to overthrow a government or take back territory. It's just to facilitate their money making. The terrorists operate in a secretive hierarchy of cells. Yes, they do. They hide from view. So do the cartels. The cartels have this hierarchy, but they function more like an international business conglomerate. If we want to understand how Sinaloa operates, we should look at an international corporation like Procter & Gamble rather than a terrorist organization like Hezbollah. The terrorists are relatively small groups. I'm told that at its heyday, Osama bin Laden's organization was a few hundred people. Most of them operating from the American perspective safely over there. I know that over there is a lot closer to other countries than it is to us, but they operated mostly from our perspective over there, non-U.S. persons, during the time of the Afghan conflict in a combat zone, so we could deal with them more easily, more flexibly. The cartels are entirely different. There are tens of thousands of people in the cartels from the American perspective. They're in every major city in the United States. They're already here. They're already armed. Many of them are U.S. persons or dual nationals, which complicates the issue. It makes it a judicial issue in dealing with them. It's not just a combat approach. My point is, at first glance, this looks like just a terrorist organization, but it's not. It is fundamentally different and needs to be dealt with in a fundamentally different manner. What we do know is that what's working for us, and I think it's going to work for everybody else, and I don't mean to criticize, but for other organizations to come together, whether you're defense or intelligence or law enforcement or the taxation, finance, and other governments, that's the only thing that's going to deal with these organizations, by being able to have a all of government approach, looking at them not just as a smuggling organization, but as a multinational conglomerate that's driven by profit, but it uses outrageous violence when it has to in order to carry out its activity. How have we done this in the United States? We have had, and if anyone needs the specific references to this, I can share them with the organizers. We have, for the first time in my 40 years of dealing with this, a integrated set of priorities across the government addressing this problem. Very shortly after the president was elected, there were a series of executive orders. Executive Order 14157, directing the sealing of the southwest border and using the military in order to do that. and another one, 14167, initiating the process of designating the cartels as foreign terrorist organizations. That started a process where defense and intelligence priorities changed as a result of that. The relatively new national defense strategy, it came out last year, lists the border and dealing with cartels at the very top. And even Russia and China and everything else comes after that. That's unprecedented. Just a few weeks ago, the Director of National Intelligence listed in her annual threat testimony that the number one concern, the top concern, she said, of the intelligence community is dealing with controlling the borders and dealing with narcotics, and everything else, including terrorism, China, what have you, goes up to the bottom. All of that has not ever been the case in the U.S. in my 40 years. That's a significant change. That's enabling the whole of government here to be able to look at the whole supply chain of precursor chemicals coming from China into Mexico, going through a synthesis, smuggled into the United States, transportation, dealing with border crossings, and also chasing the money as it comes back out. It still is the case that the purchases of drugs are done with cash. That has to be money laundered, and we're able to focus our efforts on the multifaceted ways that these sophisticated organizations are dealing with money laundering processes. I saw a question in the chat from the previous panel about that. So let me close with this thought. This whole of government effort requires working in partnership by everybody, all the organizations, to stop the encroachment of the cartels as organizations into our countries, plural, to stop the spread of fentanyl and other synthetic opioids, and they're coming up with new ones every day. And on the demand side, to help avoid overdoses, to help cut down the deaths from synthetic opioids. Things like Narcan, the spray that can be used to deal with overdoses, that has a lot to do with why the overdose deaths are coming from 100,000 down to more like 38,000. But we are in a fundamentally new area, and the deadliest threats that we face as a country today are from non-traditional sources, not from China, not from Russia, not from other military forces, not from terrorism or anything like that. These traditional intelligence threats that we have to face. It's this nexus between long-standing international organized crime. Remember, that's the target. The organizations are the target. The development of these synthetic drugs that uncouples the drug trade from the physical necessity to move bulk quantities through time and space, and the connection back to China for precursor chemicals. So I encourage us to all, as an international community, someone said, the free world. I love that sound. The free world needs to rethink the way we are organizing our military and our diplomacy, our intelligence, and our law enforcement efforts to deal with that problem. I've gone on too long, but I'm happy at the appropriate point to take any questions or comments that you may have.
So, sir, we will take the questions and answers we will do in the end. And sir, thank you so much for your time. It was very informative session. And what you rightly told about that, countering drug trafficking is the first priority of the US rather than the terrorism and China or any geopolitical scenario. So, sir, it was very insightful, sir. So here I would like to invite a second speaker of this session. Interestingly, he is the one of the most attractive personality today with us. We have with us Margarito J. Flores Jr. Mr. Margarito, along with his twin brother, Pedro, once operated one of the largest drug trafficking networks in US history, responsible for the importation and distribution of millions of dollars in narcotics across the United States and Canada. At the height of their operation, the Flores twins were directly connected to the world's most powerful drug traffickers, including El Chapo, El Mayo, and other senior members of the Sinaloa cartel. In a historic turning point, Jay voluntarily surrendered and cooperated with the US authorities, providing critical intelligence that contributed to the prosecution of high-ranking cartel leaders and reshaped international drug enforcement efforts. Today, Jay is one of the only former high-level traffickers in America, openly educating and training law enforcement. His first-hand expertise in American drug distribution and Mexican cartel operation is unmatched, offering rare insights into logistics, money movement, transportation, and criminal organizational structure. He is going to speak on the topic Understanding the Narco-Terror in the Region, a case study of his own personal journey. Welcome, sir. Welcome to the forum. The stage is all yours. Sir, you are on mute.
Thank you, Dr. Zulauf. I appreciate it. Well, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate the introduction. It's a pleasure being here. Obviously, excuse my mask, excuse my glasses. I do this for safety reasons. I am considered to be one of the most important cooperators in DA history. Me and my twin brother cooperated against the Sinaloa cartel and other drug cartels in Mexico. So I take my safety seriously here. I did put together a presentation. I just want to say a great follow-up to be coming after Mr. Dr. Zulauf too. Again, I'm going to address things from my perspective. There's obviously so many topics I could speak about, but I put together a presentation that I really believe that goes that not enough effort is being made. I agree with the terms. These drug cartels. To me, being involved at the highest levels, I started drug trafficking at the age of 7, along with my dad. We ran our first drugs across the U.S.-Mexican border before the age of 8. I grew up in the world of narcos and cartels and what today are foreign terrorist organizations. And being from the U.S., I was American. I think what I always tell every one of my every one of my classes, I tell everyone who attends is that I was American first. And before I met any drug lord, me and my organization was moving around 1,500 kilos of cocaine monthly in the Midwest region of the United States. And I think it's a good example for me to be able to describe how these organizations work, because it's not a cartel that it's overrunning a region. It's a drug cartel that, especially Mexican drug cartels, that partner with organized crime syndicates in different regions around the world, and that's what makes them strong. As it was with the case with me and my brother, the organization. So I put together a presentation. I'm going to share my screen if that's okay. Let's see if this works for me. Okay, guys. Are you guys able to see my presentation? Could somebody tell me?
Yes, we are able to see the presentation.
Yeah.
Okay, appreciate it. Okay, so to me, just being involved, I put together the presentation of the business of cartels. Okay, to me, they're more systems and logistics systems, and I think that with the current administration and everything that this current administration is doing, I think it's great. I think it's on. I never thought that the government could actually go to this extent, and for what this administration is doing, to me it's amazing. They did more in this last year and a half, I believe, than I think that most administration have done in the last 30 years. So I do believe that they're taking the right approach, and I just think there's a few points that need to be emphasized in that. Again, with my background, I work directly with the Sinaloa cartel at the highest levels. We traffic drugs from source countries in South America and importing them into Mexico, then into the United States and Canada. So I do have that first, hand experience and perspective. I spent a total of 14 years in prison, and for my crimes. And I had a lot of time to think about what made my organization successful, what made the Sinaloa cartel successful, and I wanted to give back. I do believe that, my firsthand knowledge and experience is unique. I do know that I am one of the, only persons with this type of perspective that's wanting to make change, that's teaching law enforcement. I go around the country and have seminars about this, so I really appreciate the opportunity. Our organization, along with the Sinaloa cartel, moved drugs in airplanes, trains, cargo ships, commercial vehicles, and cargo containers. We also traffic not just in cocaine, marijuana, and heroin. I was also importer of precursors from China and India, specifically New Delhi, and we use commercial cargo shipments as well as commercial cargo airplanes to ship precursors from New Delhi into Mexico. At that time, it wasn't fentanyl yet. We were using precursors like pseudoephedrine and other precursors to make methamphetamines. I work directly with some of the biggest drug lords in the world who are currently now either deceased or sitting in American prisons. I do believe we took an important piece, and we were an important piece into bringing some of these drug traffickers to justice here in the United States. And one thing I do know is that Mexican drug cartel members, and especially drug lords, one thing they fear the most is not just American prisons, but it's American laws, because the United States does punish crime, does go after drug lords, people like myself and like Chapo Guzman and Mayo Zambada, and just as recently with the Mexicans capture and killing of CJNG boss El Mencho. So they do fear the United States. These laws here that are put in place do work as a deterrent. But I don't think they're. It might seem that they're not effective, but I do believe that the United States going after these drug lords in their country is effective. Before being in Mexico because of corruption, it was a safe haven for them, and now it's an added pressure for them. And I do believe that eventually it will act as a deterrent for these drug cartels to stop being so violent and maybe being more like what's happening now in Colombia, more like ghost cartels. So I do think that the approach is going to help. And to me, I say, I bring this up. What is a cartel? What is the definition of a cartel? And the corporate definition is it's a group of independent companies or individuals that work together instead of competing, to fix prices or control a market. And I say this because I think that sometimes, especially for law enforcement and for policymakers, that gets overlooked. And my definition of what's a Mexican drug cartel is basically a drug cartel is a group of people working together for the purpose to produce, transport, or sell drugs. The objective is a profit. The only difference between a corporate cartel and a drug cartel is that the products that drug cartels move are illegal, and to me it's a business. It's not. I was on the business side. My organization was nonviolent. We worked together hand in hand with the Sinaloa cartel to distribute tons of illegal narcotics. The common misconception that I've seen as being investigated and working with the government was that we target the heads and leaders of these organizations. We drug seizures. That's probably the number one prize, the number one thing that law enforcement really goes after, because it's to them it's the reward of their work. And I as we have seen, it hasn't always been effective. The misconception that you take the head off and the organization collapses, and it's always looked at more as a pyramid type leadership, top to bottom. And to me, being involved at the highest level, I always looked at it as it was more linear. It's a bunch of different important figures working together, a bunch of different organizations that work together to distribute and sell drugs. around the world. So a good example for me is that, if we compare them to a corporate company, and my comparison is always like, Amazon, that you remove Jeff Bezos, from Amazon, you're still receiving packages, okay? You will still receive your Amazon packages. You remove the CEO from McDonald's, you would still be able to go to your local McDonald's and eat the same burger that you were beforehand. And a greatest example is Apple. Steve Jobs passed away, decades ago, and Apple continues to exist and continues to put out products, and are still considered the top corporation in the world. The core principles to me in the cartel is that you have fragments of groups of people that work together and work together to distribute and to import drugs, and everyone shares a different role. It's not, although these drug lords are the leaders, they will be the leader of their organization, and they facilitate the ability for other drug trafficking organizations to work with them as a support and underneath them, but they are not ran by one person or one organization. And what I see that they're really great at is partnering. Partner with different organized crime organizations around the world. If it's in Canada, especially today in Canada, or their collaboration and partnership with biker gangs and Italian mafia and the triads makes them be able to use their networks and use their control of different regions of the legal markets to be able to distribute their drugs, and it works the same around the world. And I've never seen a drug cartel, even here in the United States, overtake. And I know that's the common misconception, is that there's drug cartels that operate in 200 I believe 76 countries around the world, but they don't control the market. Even for me, at one time I could have been one of the biggest drug distributors in the United States, and especially for our organization, we focus on the central United States and the eastern northeast region of the United States. But we work with the cartel. They did not control. It's an open market. It's free enterprise. We were allowed to do whatever we wanted with those drugs as long as they received payment and were paid for their drugs. So they look for partnerships, and what I see is that for those countries that lag behind focusing, and because of their laws or lack of laws of going to after organized crime, like in the United States has done over the years with the Italian mafia and different organizations, that a lot of these countries fail to have a good understanding. And your previous speaker, Dr. Zulauf, here basically said it's intelligence, right? Because there's no laws or policies that are able to target these organizations, and it doesn't provide any want of anyone to basically break off, like me and my brother did, and cooperate with authorities against some of these organizations. And to me, the most important tool for law enforcement, for the government, is intelligence. It's informants, people like me who provide inside knowledge of how these organizations are operating. And I do believe that changing the laws to be able to make it lucrative and make it enticing for people to break away from these organizations and come in and cooperate, or even target them for arrest, I think that will make a big difference. But the lack of in these countries is what makes these organizations very strong. It's someone's fear to cooperate against them. Right now, we are, to me, it's the common focus for over 50 years that there's just been war on drugs, especially here in the United States, that I feel like this country has actually dealt more with the drug issues than any other country has been that, the United States and law enforcement government most of the time target product leadership, and celebrate the seizures and arrests. And that's not, to me, a way that would be effective in combating these, foreign terrorist organizations, transnational crime syndicates now. There has to be more done. And I believe that even though it's great, it has to be a multifaceted approach. The same effort that goes to arrest these drug lords and seize these drugs. And right now we see that the United States is taking military action in the Pacific and Atlantic Ocean and bombing some of these drug vessels. I think that's more symbolic, but I think we have to take the same approach in going after the systems that makes them strong. It's a business. To me, even though drugs are distributed, drugs flow out, money flows back. And for us, we, at one time we're trafficking close to 3,000 kilos of cocaine alone every month. We were not measuring our success by the kilos we were selling. We were measuring by the money that we were making. And that's what the cartels do. Their main objective is a profit. Their main objective is to bring back cash, to bring back those profits that they invest. And those investments are the fuel of these organizations. They're the ones that entice people like me, young adults or people all around the world, to get into the drug trade. If there wasn't such a large profit, I don't think that there'll be so many young men trying to join these cartels and risk their life. And I believe that's what we have to target, is the money that flows back, this money that fuels, corruption, money that's used to buy weapons, to buy armies. What I see, especially on social media, that we have this common misconception of what the cartel looks when you see these people wearing, ski masks with utility vests and AKs, which is it is a part of it, but that is not the business. That's what these people who have the money to be able to buy those bullets and pay for those men. That's what you get with power, and to me, money is the power. My organization alone moved over $3 billion of bulk U.S. currency. That's cash. I know right now there's a lot of us that talk about cryptocurrency and different methods of money laundering. And I think that those are all important, but I don't believe we have even targeted, even here in the United States or around the world, the business of cash, the business of, that's the way drug cartels operate. The business of drugs are paid for in cash and bulk U.S. currency, in euros and different currencies around the world. It's important because we don't want anyone to trace us back. We don't want to leave any paper trail. And one of the things is to give you an example, is that what $3 billion of bulk U.S. currency weighs, people really don't take that into consideration. For someone like me who operates at the highest level, it does, is that because the denominations of drugs are, your common denomination is $20 bill, we move back an average of 3,000 metric tons of cash in weight back into Mexico. And that goes for mostly any drug. From my experience, that for every pound or kilo of illegal narcotics, you need at least 1.5 kilos to 2 kilos of the same weight in currency to be sent back to the source countries. If it's Mexico, South American countries, or even precursor countries that are providing these precursors. So I think that gets overlooked. There's a big difference between drug seizures, especially here, like in the United States, where the United States is doing a great job with the sealment of the southern border, but and going after so many seizures. I think last year alone there was about over 1 million pounds of illegal narcotics seized. And from my firsthand experience, I would say that we don't there should have been at least 2 million pounds of U.S. currency seized, but that wasn't the case. Last year alone, I think the government seized around $105 million collectively in the United States, and that doesn't equate to how many drugs are coming into the United States and into Canada. And it's been it's common here for law enforcement, even around the world, law enforcement I speak to, even while I was operating, that they don't. It's law enforcement doesn't go after the money, especially in the bulk U.S. currency. Drug traffickers separate the business of drugs and the business of money. It's two different entities, and this works, for cartels or smaller drug trafficking organizations, even at the street level. They don't mix money with drugs, and I think that for me, it's the common push that I say: you take away the money and you take away some of the power. And I do see that as long as we don't change that mindset, the demand continues to increase, and we have to bring down the demand. If not, you have different people, different organizations all around the world. The consumption of drug use is spreading, and it's only going to make these drug cartels even more powerful because of the money that they're making, the profits that they're making. I think that historically it's just been the same type of mindset. It's going after the supply, and cartels and drug trafficking organizations and criminal organizations will evolve. You see you see it with fentanyl, and more. I see it that's going to be continue to evolve to synthetic drugs, and this is where a lot of these countries, especially a country like India, that provides a major source of the precursors. Countries like China, but as the government starts to target these countries, they look for other countries to basically supply these, but the way these organizations are targeted, it's old. It's nothing new, and I do believe that it has to change. It has to be targeted more as a system, than a drug cartel or a criminal organization. It's two separate entities. To me, it's you're most governments look at their finding these criminals. I believe we have to take the approach of finding a system, right? And because the system is designed to survive arrest, to survive seizures, to survive somebody being taken away from that organization. So it to me, it's more, we need to treat it more like a business, and fight them like a business. And in order for business to succeed, you need money. And I believe that we have to put more emphasis on going after the bulk U.S. currency, and different currencies that come back to source countries that provide them the fuel to be able to go and be able to take over, and sometimes even governments, and pay for corruption, and pay for military style weapons, and pay for armies that of people who have no fear of spreading violence in Mexico and these source countries. I don't see cartel violence spreading over to the United States, because again, the misconception is that cartels run certain cities in America, but it's always going to be your local organized crime, your gangs, organizations like me who work with American gangs, and they control those markets. They're not thinking about taking over regions or taking over cities or neighborhoods. They're looking to partner up, just like a franchise would in a corporate company. I know I didn't have a lot of time. There's so many things I could probably speak about just hearing this. So I appreciate being able to be here, and I'm more than happy to continue the conversation. I have my QR code, so you guys could reach out to me, email me if you have any questions. But I will take some questions if we have time to do so.
We will take the questions at the end of the session. We're really thankful. We are very thankful for our time, and we heartily appreciate you coming to the other side of the society and now helping the government. I believe that U.S. government will be now more successful working with you in countering these cartels. So Jay, thank you so much for our time. the question and answer will take up again.
Thank you. Thank you.
So our
Mike.
next, so our next speaker for this session is Mike Chavarria. Mr. Mike is a former supervisory special agent at the Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA. He retired as a DEA supervisory special agent with 33 years experience in counter narcotics and investigation across the US-Mexico border and Latin America. Recognized global expert in narco-terrorism and frequent media commentator. He has received the DEA's Coveted Administrators Award, and in 2007, he was honored to be named Super Cop by Texas-based The 100 Club for his role in investigating involving Chile. He is going to speak on the topic Cartels in Mexico, Parallel State Violence and Power Struggle. Sir, the stage is all yours.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be invited to participate on this forum, very important forum. I'd like to echo the words of Dr. Zulauf in that, I'm a retired DEA agent of 32 years. I do not speak on behalf of the DEA nor the US government. My comments have to do with my own experiences. And so let me just give a brief background on my history with the DEA. I spent 32 years with assignments in South America, Central America, and 2 in Mexico, 1 in Guadalajara, where I was a supervisor, I was a resident agent in charge, and then again in Mexico City, where I served as a liaison with the Mexican counterparts in an effort to establish a wiretapping platform. I came on the job in 1985, and I was assigned along the Mexican border. I also had two assignments along the Mexican border during my career, one in California, the other one in Texas. When I first signed on in 1985, the cartel landscape was something unrecognizable from what we see today. There were 3 cartels. They were the Guadalajara cartel, the Juarez cartel, and Guadalajara and Juarez were pretty much partnered up. And then there was the Gulf cartel. On the rise, emerging, was the Arellano Felix family that was going to take control over the Tijuana cartel because of that very lucrative corridor. So, of course, in those days, I was a rookie, but I did know and realize that there was relatively little violence in comparison to what we see today. Is everybody hearing me okay? Just raise your hand. Okay, fantastic. So let's jump to today. Well, the cartels in the early or mid 80s were well defined. And there were really no turf wars going on. Most of the violence was infighting within a particular cartel. But there were no drug wars per se. Now let's jump to what we have today. What we have today are 2 cartels that I consider mega cartels. And of the 2, CJNG and Sinaloa, CJNG is clearly the global threat. No longer is the threat the United States and Mexico. The threat has grown well beyond Mexico, well beyond the Western Hemisphere, and is now a global threat affecting all of us. And I agree with Dr. Zulauf, who made some very, very good points in terms of his distinction, defining criminal versus terrorist. And I also I agree with his solution about it being a unified effort between law enforcement, intelligence, and military assets around the world. And that is where the cartels basically have us at a disadvantage. They don't deal with budgets. They don't deal with bureaucracy. They don't deal with sovereignty issues. they have one goal and an objective to meet that goal, and it's about money, power, and control. Um, and that is where we are at a major disadvantage, because we're constrained by budgets. We have attorneys that determine the legality of one thing or the other. We have multiple agencies with different agendas. And I'm talking about with the United States. Whenever you inject the human factor, things usually start to get off track for one reason or another. Let's talk about the CJNG though, and why. Let me first describe them. I think it was described by one of our earlier speakers. They are, like I said, a mega cartel. They operate as like a corporate entity, not the way Amazon does, like Mr. Flores had discussed, but they're also quasi-government, which had been stated earlier, and they control an army. I mean, the CJNG is all over Mexico and all over the world, and at least in Mexico, they have an army at their beck and call, which is why we all witnessed what we witnessed when Mencho, the Mencho's operation went down. There were explosions and combative assaults on towns all over Mexico, which should tell you that they are in every state in Mexico and are controlling the drug flow. Now, why is the CJNG, just to use them as an example, why are they so powerful? Well, first of all, you have to know a little bit of the history as to how they came to be. They inherited an organization that was already powerful in and of itself, and that comes from the Valencia family, otherwise known as the Millennium Cartel. That Millennium Cartel was founded by Armando Valencia Cornelio. I met him while we were in Mexico in an effort to get him to try to cooperate with us so that he could, get some potential credit for his impending sentence. It never came to fruition, but I learned a lot talking to him. I realized that he was very heavy into methamphetamine from the very early days when the meth production transitioned from the United States into Mexico because of the pressures we put on the access to illicit precursors and essential chemicals. Armando Valencia grew an organization that was considered one of the more powerful organizations during the mid-90s, late 90s, early 2000s. The Mexican Attorney General, Marcelo de la Concha, considered Armando Valencia and his organization to be importing a third of all the cocaine that entered Mexico on its way to the United States and elsewhere around the world. A third, which meant in those days he was powerful. So where did the CJNG come from? The CJNG was formed by the Valencia family. Specifically, Mencho married into the Valencia family. He was a lieutenant working for our family members of Armando Valencia, namely his nephews, Oscar Nava Valencia and the brother Juan Carlos Nava Valencia. They were also working together with a cousin by the name of Luis Valencia Valencia. They were all continuing that enterprise that was created years ago by Armando. They were already kings of the cocaine or methamphetamine industry. In 2007, there was a seizure of $207 million in Mexico City. That was tied to the Valencia's organization. So they had already frontiered the whole process of bringing precursor chemicals in from China and other countries like India, Germany, and even Turkey, which is where a lot of these chemicals are still coming in for the production of fentanyl. So the organization was inherited. Why is it powerful to this day? Well, because they've grown and they've become sophisticated. Technology serves us as law-abiding citizens, but it also serves them. Okay, and I agree to an extent of what Mr. Flores had to say about the value of chasing the dollar, bulk cash, money. It's flowing across the borders from the United States right into Mexico. I've been told that by other kingpins like OCL Cardenas Guillen when he was extradited to Houston in 2007. He said, you wouldn't imagine how much money flows from your country into ours. Now, the problem is, I think outpacing the flow of bulk cash is the transfer of value, because now we're on the world stage. So how do you get dollars across the ocean? Cryptocurrency. Okay. The dark web, cryptocurrency, other digital assets. It's not so much the transfer of dollar, it's the transfer of value. And the transfer of value is perpetrated using both witting and unwitting brokers. Right now, I can tell you many of DEA's investigations focus on 3 countries where that is happening, and it's Mexico, China, and the United States. Again, using brokers, witting and unwitting, working with illicit proceeds from illicit production and transportation, distribution of narcotics, as well as legitimate industry. So it's combined, intertwined, and it's very difficult to go after that. But like Jay had said, and so did Dr. Zulauf, we're not going to be able to do it without human intelligence. Human sources need to be tasked to infiltrate. Is it dangerous? Yes, it is. But we're still controlling informants who are embedded in these organizations. And that's what led to Mencho's downfall. Other than the fact that violence was what brings an end to every cartel, really. And so, you know, I'm going to jump around here a little bit, but what do we need to do? We need to seek a unified partnership with across the world, and come up with an approach to go after the money. They can make more drugs, they can't make more money. That's where they get hurt. Okay, that is how we affect a real change. Now let's go back and just talk a little bit, and I know we're just limited time here, but I want to talk about how we got to where we are today with the violence, which I consider personally, I see it as a state in crisis in Mexico. I think it's a very dangerous place. The U.S. State Department has indicated, travel warnings for U.S. citizens traveling down there, or for anybody traveling into Mexico. Law-abiding citizens, Mexican citizens, tourists, they happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. They're not safe. So how did the violence occur to where we're seeing it today? Let's go back in the 1985 when I joined the DEA. There were a couple significant pivotal incidents and events that triggered international attention on Mexico and its drug trafficking threat. Namely, 1985, one of our agents was kidnapped very close to the U.S. consulate, tortured and murdered. That was 1985. 1993, one of the 2 Catholic cardinals in Mexico, Juan Posadas Ocampo, was killed at the Guadalajara airport. That's still a mystery. It's still an unsolved homicide. The actual shooter has not been brought to justice, but it had to do with him being in the wrong place at the wrong time He was murdered. That was 1993. After that, at the fall, once the Guadalajara cartel fell, pretty much dismantled by 1989, that is when the first drug war broke out between underbosses of the Sinaloa Federation, remnants of the Guadalajara cartel, namely Chapo Guzman, Mayo Zambada, went to war with the Arellano Felix family over the use of the Tijuana corridor. That was the first opportunity where the world got to see drug war live, and there was no hiding it. That really set the bar and the tone for the pressures that ensued between the United States and Mexico to go after these cartels and dismantle them. It was the violence, the violence. What happened after that? The OCL Cardenas Guillen, the head of the Gulf cartel, recruited, organized Zetas, specially trained Mexico's special forces were recruited to become subordinate to the Gulf cartel. Subordinate to the Gulf cartel. Well, what happened was they weren't satisfied with being subordinate to the Gulf cartel. They saw the lucrative potential that the drug industry had given them. So they went and formed their own organization, the Zetas organization. That all occurred between the late 90s, and by 2003, OCL Cardenas was brought. He was arrested in Mexico, in prison, and then extradited in 2007. I got a chance to meet him, sit down, and talk to him, and he explained a lot of that background that I'm giving to you about the violence. He told us, he said, without me, the Gulf and the Zetas are going to fall apart, and the violence in Mexico is going to go crazy. And it did. And it did. When Felipe Calderon came in between 2006 and 2012, he came in with a campaign designed to fight the drug war and bring an end to the Gulf and the Zetas. Well, we teamed up with Mexico, and I think we had a significant success. We were very successful in fracturing both the Gulf and the Zetas. But what else was going on in the country at the time that we didn't know about? We didn't know that there were elements of the Mexican government that were aligned with the Sinaloa cartel. The Sinaloa cartel, in essence, was helping to fight that drug war to defeat their competitors, the Gulf and the Zetas. Well, the goal was to attack the violence, and what it did between 2006 and 2012, the violence just went sky high, and it was almost like witnessing, a combat zone in the Middle East. The violence didn't go away; it increased. And what we did and let me go back, the Gulf and the Zetas fractured at the same time. There was infighting within the Sinaloa cartel. Chapo, Mayo, Nacho Coronel, the Valencias, they all started to fight amongst themselves. The Beltran Leyva organization, made up of Beltran Leyva siblings, they were all part of the same Sinaloa cartel. They went to war with one another. Some went, Beltran Leyva sided with the Gulf and the Zetas and with the Juarez. But all of that ultimately led to a multi-fracturing scenario where we have what we see today. 2 mega cartels that are threatening, and at least 25 mini cartels that really, many of them are subordinate to the 2 main cartels, CJNG and Sinaloa. So that's what we have to deal with today. And so the violence is still an issue. The levels of violence controlled by the CJNG, like I said, they have their own military. And that is, as I had heard Dr. Zulauf mention, the Mexican counterparts, even if they want to, cannot get their hands around in a fashion where they can control it. It's going to be a long-term, drawn-out, protracted war with these cartels, and the only way we're going to have impact is consistency and unified alignment with our partners, and not just Mexico, but I'm talking all of Latin America and our partners in around the world. Now, like Mr. J. Flores had mentioned, the challenge that we also have is the fact that the CJNG, I'll just use them as an example, they're joined up at the hip with all of these other organized crime organizations. They're smart. They know how to maintain and sustain themselves as an ongoing threat and an entity. Every organized crime behavior, criminal behavior, from arms smuggling to human smuggling, sex trafficking, extortion, organized theft of petroleum, they all have drug nexus. And like they said about all roads lead to Rome, well, all roads lead to Mexico these days. And of course, you know, we can't forget our friends in Colombia as well. But I'm half Costa Rican from my dad's side, and I can tell you that Costa Rica is no longer a peaceful place to go and be a tourist. They're experiencing the effects of Mexico's violence growing outside its borders. I think I'll just end with that and just take any questions at the end of this forum. But I just want to say thank you very much for the invitation. I know there's a lot to talk about. Mexico has a very rich history, and I just want to end with saying this. I love Mexico. Mexico is a beautiful country. The people are very, very wonderful. They're by and large, they're law-abiding. They want to bring an end to all of this. I'm sure they were happy to see CJNG leader Mencho get taken down. It's just a small group of organized thugs who are terroristic, not necessarily terrorists like Dr. Zulauf says, but terroristic in their violence. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Max. Thank you so much for your time. We really learned a lot from you, especially about the history of the cartels. Thank you so much. So our next speaker of the session is Dr. Alba Maria Gonzalez Rolon, who is a distinguished jurist and expert in security and organized crime. She has dedicated more than 3 decades to the justice system, serving as a criminal trial judge in Paraguay and as a member of specialized courts addressing organized crime. She has been engaged as an expert by the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. Currently, she practices law as a consultant and serves as a university professor. She will speak on the topic, the rise of synthetic drugs, meth, fentanyl, and the new drug economy in Mexico. The floor is all yours.
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Alba Maria Gonzalez Rolon. Today, I will briefly discuss a rise of synthetic drugs and their impact on the criminal economy in Mexico. Please, me a second, please. Okay. In recent years, the global drug problem has undergone a profound transformation. For decades, when we spoke about drug trafficking, the dominant image was associated with illicit crops, land routes, hidden shipments, and criminal organization competing for territorial control over substances such as cocaine, heroin, or marijuana. However, that image is no longer sufficient. Today, the center of gravity has shifted toward a different reality, the rise of synthetic drugs, particularly methamphetamine and fentanyl. These syntheses have introduced a new logic, one that is more flexible, more profitable, and significantly more difficult to control. According to recent global assessment, synthetic drug markets have expanded rapidly, and seizures of amphetamine-type stimulant jab reached record levels, confirming that this is not an isolated phenomenon, but a structural transformation. Within this new landscape, Mexico occupies a central role. It can no longer be understood merely as a transit country. Mexico has become a strategic hub for production, criminal assembly, logistic, and exportation of synthetic drugs, with direct implication for domestic security and for international stability. For this reason, we are no longer speaking only about drugs. We are speaking about a transformation of the criminal economy, about the adaptive capacity of organized crime, and about a phenomenon that affects public health, national security, and governance far beyond Mexico's borders. The background from agricultural drug trafficking to industrial production. To fully understand this transformation, it is necessary to briefly look at this historical development. For much of the 20th century and into the early 21st century, Mexico played a key role primarily as a transit corridor for cocaine produced in South America and destined for the United States. At the same time, it maintained domestic and export markets linked to marijuana and heroin, both of which depended on agricultural production. In that model, organized crime required land, territorial control, and agricultural infrastructure. However, this logic began to change rapidly as criminal groups realized that they could reduce risk, increase profits, and operate with greater autonomy by shifting from agricultural production to synthetic manufacturing. Methamphetamine became one of the first major drivers of this transformation. Its production allowed criminal organizations to detach from agricultural cycles and move toward laboratory-based manufacturing. Today, it is widely documented that the vast majority of methamphetamine consumed in the United States is produced in Mexico, while domestic clandestine laboratories in the United States have significantly declined. This shift reveals a critical structural change. Mexico evolved from a transit platform into a large-scale production center. The second major turning point was the emergence of illicit fentanyl. Unlike heroin, fentanyl does not require poppy cultivation. It's entirely synthetic and extraordinarily potent. Medical authorities have noted that fentanyl is up to 50 times more potent than heroin and 100 times more potent than morphine. This means that very small quantities can generate enormous numbers of doses, extremely high profits, and at the same time, a dramatically increased risk of fatal overdose. Within this context, major organizations such as the Sinaloa Cartel and the Jalisco New Generation Cartel consolidated their role as central actors in this new synthetic economy. The current problem, how synthetic drugs have changed the rules. The issue today is not simply that more drugs are available. The real issue is that synthetic drugs have fundamentally altered the operational and economic logic of drug trafficking. The first transformation is the industrialization of crime. Synthetic drugs are products in clandestine laboratories that can be installed, dismantled, and relocated with relative speed. This makes criminal organizations far more resilient to law enforcement action. When an illicit crop is eradicated, its recovery requires time, land, and environmental conditions. But when a laboratory is dismantled, another one can quickly be reestablished elsewhere. The second transformation is the depends on global supply chains of chemical precursors. The final products may be manufactured in Mexico, but its components often originate abroad. This means that drug trafficking is transnational from its very origin. Production, transportation, distribution, and financial laundering are all part of a single interconnected system. The third transformation is extreme profitability. Fentanyl allows traffickers to move small quantities with massive distribution potential. Pricing data show that tens of millions of fentanyl pills have been sized in a single year, representing hundreds of millions of potentially lethal doses. The fourth transformation is lethality. In the United States alone, tens of thousands of deaths annually are linked to synthetic opioids, particularly fentanyl. The fifth transformation is adaptability. Synthetic drugs are distributed through traditional routes, but also through digital platforms, social media, and fragmented networks. We are facing a criminal economy that is flexible, globalized, and technologically integrated. Concrete case, to better understand this phenomenon, it is useful to consider a specific example. The first example is the relocation of methamphetamine production. 2 decades ago, thousands of clandestine laboratories using the United States. Today, that number has dropped dramatically as production has shifted almost entirely to Mexico. This shift demonstrates a structural transformation in the geography of drug productions. Mexico is no longer only a transit route, but a primary manufacturing job. The second example is the proliferation of counterfeit pills containing fentanyl. These pills are designed to resemble leech-treatment medication, but may contain lethal doses of synthetic opioids. This significantly increases the risk of unintentional consumption, particularly among young people. The third example is the role of chemical precursors. The problem does not begin with the final drugs, but with the global supply chain that enables its production. Without addressing this chain, enforcement efforts remain incomplete. The fourth example is the adaptability of major Mexican cartels. Organizations such as the Sinaloa Cartels and the Jalisco New Generation Cartel have integrated production, transportation, distribution, and financial operation into a single criminal ecosystem. These examples demonstrate that this is not a local threat, but a global criminal network. The national consequence in Mexico at the national level, the expansion of synthetic drugs have significantly strengthened the operational and financial capacity of criminal organization. The first consequence is the financial empowerment of cartel. Higher profitability translates into greater resources, greater influence, and greater capacity of expansion. This financial growth allows criminal groups to diversify their activities, including arms trafficking, extortions, money laundering, and territorial control. The second consequence is the reconfiguration of violence. Synthetic drugs do not eliminate territorial disputes, they transform them. Conflicts now focus on strategic points such as ports, borders crossings, laboratories, and distribution corridors. The third consequence is institutional corruption. As criminal profits increase, so does the ability to infiltrate state structures. This undermines governance, weakens public institutions, and erodes trust in the rules of law. The fourth consequence is the growing challenge to national security. The state faces increasingly sophisticated criminal structures with high level of adaptability and resources. Finally, there is the expansion of public health risk within Mexico itself. As production increases, so does domestic exposure and vulnerability. In this context, synthetic drugs do not merely sustain organized crime, they reshape its power within the state. The international consequence. At the international level, the impact of synthetic drugs products in or trafficked through Mexico is immediate and profound. The first and most visible consequence is the overdose crisis in the United States. In recent years, hundreds of thousands of deaths have been linked to synthetic opioids, particularly illicit fentanyl. This is not only a public health emergency, but also a matter of national security. The second consequence is the globalization of criminal networks. Chemical precursors move across borders, productions they place in one country, distribution in another, and profits are laundered internationally. This means that the synthetic drugs trade in inherently transnational. Their consequence is the expansion into new markets. Europe and other regions are increasingly affected by synthetic drugs distribution networks. This raises concern about the global reach of Mexican criminal organizations. The fourth consequence is the interconnection with other forms of crime. Synthetic drug trafficking is closely linked to money laundering, arms trafficking, and corruption, and illicit financial systems. Drug trafficking is no longer an isolated activity. It is part of an integrated criminal system. In this context, synthetic drugs represent not only a regional threat, but a global challenge to security and governance. And the new drug economy, all of this leads to a central idea: we are facing a new drug economy. This economy does not depend on agriculture. It operates globally. It is highly profitable, it adapts rapidly, and it produces severe harm. Methamphetamine and fentanyl have not only changed the product, they have changed the structure of criminal power itself. This means that if we continue to analyze synthetic drugs using traditional frameworks, we will misunderstand the problem and we will respond too late. In conclusion, the rise of synthetic drugs in Mexico is not simply another phase of drug trafficking. It is a structural transformation. We are dealing with a model that is more profitable, more adaptable, more difficult to control, and more global. The response cannot be limited to interdictions. It must include intelligence, international cooperation, financial control, and institutional strengthening. Because the real challenge is not only to find a new drug, but to understand that synthetic drugs have created a new architecture of organized crime. And today that architecture just has one of its central pillars in Mexico. Thank you very much for your attention. It has been a privilege to share this topic with you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you so much for your time. And it was a very insightful presentation. What you told about the details of the cartels and the drugs itself. It was very insightful. Thank you so much. Our final speaker for the session is Stefano Ritondelli. Mr. Stefano is the Chief Intelligence Officer at Artorias, a company specializing in AI-driven data aggregation, intelligence analysis, and geopolitical risk insights. He is also the founder and operator of All Source News, a widely followed investigative platform on X dedicated to monitoring and analyzing Mexican cartel activity and cross-border security trends. U.S. Army veteran with 10 years of service as an armor officer in both activity and the reserves with extensive military intelligence background. Stefano served as a battalion and a brigade intelligence officer in charge, including during Operation Border Support, as well as a 1-month training mission to Mexico to train the Mexican army in counter-cartel operations. He is going to speak on the topic Cartels Beyond Mexico, Transnational Criminal Network in Europe, Asia, and beyond. Sir, the stage is all yours.
Well, first, thank you so much for having us. It's a true honor, and it's glad to see other experts talking about this very important topic. So I want to thank the INDEC Research Group for hosting this and enabling and giving us the opportunity to discuss about this. One of the things I'd like to highlight, I think all the speakers kind of already touched upon this, but it's important when we're analyzing Mexican cartels outside of Mexico and the United States, is how we're all in agreement that Mexican cartels are profit-motivated organizations, and we've used a lot of examples to kind of highlight it. And for this specific topic, you know, I want to focus on one of the main issues when we're talking about Mexican cartels, first inside of Mexico, that then will help us explain how they operate outside of Mexico. Because I agree, Mexican cartels, I view them, the example I say is imagine Amazon and the very famous, you know, U.S. mercenary group, Blackwater or Wagner, kind of merged into one, right? And at the end of the day, they just have a very strong military component, but they're profit motivated, and that's the key driver in how they operate. Another way to analyze Mexican cartels also is look at the shipping container Maersk, right? Mexican cartels from a drug perspective, but not only drugs, they deal with a lot of products. For example, we know they smuggle oil, avocados, lime, water, timber. Key example, you can't analyze the violence in Michoacan without talking about the avocado and lime trade and how both Jalisco New Generation Cartel and the United Cartels actively battle for that smuggling network of avocados to the United States. But generally how Mexican cartels operates also is, in many aspects, they're logistical juggernauts. And their main goal and responsibility is to get the product to the consumer, most of it to the United States, but it can also be in Asia or Europe. And in that construct, they very much operate as the shipping containing Maersk, right? If you look at a shipping container Maersk, they have product, let's say in Shanghai, their end destination is Los Angeles. Their goal is to get that shipment from Shanghai to LA, and then they take a step back, and then it's the responsibility of others to kind of push that drugs down to the consumer. Then the cartels operate in a lot of sense, as all the speakers kind of highlighted in everything from synthetic drugs, fentanyl, cocaine, even historically marijuana. In reality, the Mexican cartel's job is to get it to an end destination in the United States, but not directly to the consumer. That's where you see these gangs and local groups operate. So when we're analyzing this outside of Mexico, what do we see in Europe and in Asia? And it's a very similar construct. And there's two kind of trends that we're seeing internationally right now with Mexican cartels when we're talking about their reach in Europe and the trafficking. One, obviously they follow that same model, right? We see this in Australia, we see this with drug shipments into Southeast Asia, when we see this in Europe. Mostly cocaine is the predominant drug, but they also do others. And their goal is to get it to the consumer base there, right? And that can leverage a lot of the networks in South America that they have business dealing with. So the two major cartels that have the most international reach is the Jalisco New Generation Cartel and the Sinaloa Cartel. And these are the groups that leverage their connections and networks in South America, because the vast majority of the cocaine is produced in Colombia, to then ship that cocaine over into Europe and in Asia. The other aspect, though, we're also seeing is this new development in a way of the large, if we're analyzing Mexican cartels for the last, let's say, 40 years, and we're looking at it within the last decade, in the last 5 years, is a very interesting development of now these Mexican cartels are actually setting up drug laboratories in Europe, in Africa, in Asia, so they're able to produce their own drugs that are specifically synthetic drugs. But also, crazily enough, we've even got some reporting of even cocaine labs being seized in overseas in these countries, and cartels just producing the drugs in these countries to then enable that distribution inside of Europe or Asia. or even Africa, right? Kenya, there was a CG&G cell that was seized last year that was involved in methamphetamine trade. And so this kind of highlights also a level of sophistication, and it enables these Mexican cartels not to be so reliant on these South American drug trafficking organizations or the networks that they have to establish there to push drugs over into Europe, Asia, and Africa. Because again, at the end of the day, the cartel's main responsibility is to send product in bulk, and then it's others to push that down. If you're able to produce these drugs locally, you eliminate a large component that law enforcement really focuses and analyzes and tries to track to disrupt it, specifically these narco submarines or maritime trafficking, which is the primary way that Mexican cartels leverage and push drugs internationally, is the maritime route. So if you're able to produce these drugs in the country, you're in a better position to avoid law enforcement and try to get these drugs over there. But that requires you to establish a base of operations in these countries, and more importantly, recruit specialists such as chemists to be able to set up these drug laboratories. And so if you're law enforcement personnel, one of the things that we started to see is a lot of Mexican chemists are part of these cells that are being disbanded and dismantled in Asia, Africa, and the United States, and in Europe, because these chemists are keys to set up these drug laboratories in these countries and try to produce everything over there without being so reliant in Mexico or America for the drug trafficking. So that's something to always keep an eye on, that's a new development that we're really seeing. And I think that has an opportunity with the power of synthetic drugs, with the ability to produce methamphetamine and the logistical networks that both from China, India, et cetera, that Mexican cartels are able to tap into to produce these drugs. We are going to see more and more cases of drug laboratories being set up in these countries and not so reliant on either drug trafficking from South America or even Mexico to do this, with cocaine being the one exception because the vast majority of that is produced in Colombia. But again, we are seeing that interesting trend being developed in Europe and others where they're setting up their drug laboratories. Another component that I think is important to talk about, where we, the other speakers were mentioning, was this idea, the militarization nature of Mexican cartels. And what's very interesting is if you're analyzing Mexican cartels, you have to analyze them from Mexico first and try to have an understanding there of how they operate, because they don't necessarily operate the same way internationally, right? The ways Mexican cartels operate inside of Mexico is vastly different than what we see internationally. And a key example is this in the violence. As a lot of speakers and myself through my account, All Source News, that track Mexican cartels in Mexico, they're inherently very violent inside of Mexico. But one of the interesting aspects of this is that that violence doesn't always translate internationally. It doesn't necessarily demonstrate inside of Mexican cartels overseas, even into the United States, let alone, let's say, Europe, Asia, or India, or China, right? Mexican cartels don't generally fight their turf wars in Mexico's international. You can look at the alliances that Mexican cartels have internationally, and in Europe and Asia, they all have different groups and syndicates that they rely on to be their allies. But for the most part, the way that they operate internationally is the business and transactional perspective. It's not the territorial worlds that is just very much solidified inside of Mexico, right? Because in Mexico, we basically have a situation where cartels are becoming much more territorial. Historically, if we look at the example of the Guadalajara cartel, the Guadalajara cartel is what would be by definition what we'd consider a transactional cartel. We need to sell a product to the United States. Back in the day with the Guadalajara cartels was marijuana. We have the marijuana, we can produce it. So our goal is to just get the marijuana from Mexico over to the United States, and that's our primary area of business. There are some incidents and levels of violence, but the violence is not the end goal or a key mean to achieve that economic end. Right? In the end of the day, the primary factor of this is through transactional businesses that requires you to open cooperations either with corrupt government officials or other criminal organizations to be able and enable that transactional aspect to push drugs over. It's much more of a business-centric relationship. One of the interesting aspects that we're seeing in Mexico that I think explains better than any other of the models why we're seeing violence skyrocketed in Mexico is because they're all transitioning into this other model or are incorporating significant different types of model, what we would consider territorial cartel. In other words, the control of the territory for the Mexican cartels becomes the central business model that these cartels depend on to be able to then push product into the United States. And that fight for territory explains the violence inside of Mexico, because they require that territorial control either for drug distribution or production, or just control and extortion as well to push drugs into the United States or into other parts of around the world. A great example of a territorial cartel would be the Zetas cartel, right? And another good example of the territorial cartels would be the cartels that are more closely in the border, that don't have access to the drug production and distribution networks further, either in South America or inside of Mexico. For example, now the Flores cartel, the Northeast cartel, the Arana Felix organization, they make their money because of the territory they control along the border, and those drugs get pushed through them that then they're able to charge a fee. But the territorial control is the primary business model, not what in a transactional cartel, it's a secondary aspect. What I'm seeing is this transition to territorial cartel. But what's very interesting is that internationally, that is not the business model that cartels are focused on. They're still primarily a transactional organization, and that is their main focus and effort outside of just drug trafficking in the United States. Specifically, we're talking about Africa, Europe, and Asia. It is that business model, and it kind of explains why violence inside of Mexico doesn't export itself necessarily to other parts around the world. A key example of this is the closest that you can maybe look at maybe an exportation of Mexican cartel violence is Ecuador. But Ecuadorian gangs have their own reasonings why they fight that Mexican cartels just jump and bagwagon over to just inherit their own drug trafficking from Ecuador to the United States. But the vast majority of the violence is dictated by Ecuadorian gangs, specifically Los Lobos y Los Torneros, who are allied with CJG and then the Sinaloa cartel in themselves. But that violence we don't see that in Europe. And most of the gang violence that we do see in Europe, Africa, and Asia are much more further down the food chain, let's say the drug distribution network, not necessarily the cartel who's pushing the bulk of the product over to these countries. And the violence of the gangs is further down, who are now trying to battle out for access to the consumer, not necessarily access to the drug cartel themselves. And I think a perfect example that explains this, why we're not seeing an exportation of cartel violence, is this case study that we have right now related to the Sinaloa cartel. For those who don't know, the Sinaloa cartel right now is in an active civil war. There are two factions of the Sinaloa cartel. Los Chapitos is one. Those are the sons of El Chapo. There's four brothers, or four sons of El Chapo. Ivan Archibaldo, who's the overall leader of Los Chapitos, and Jesus Alfredo, one of the brothers, because the other two brothers are now in prison in the United States, Ovidio Guzman and Joaquin Guzman. So the two brothers and two sons of El Chapo are with the Chapitos, and then the other faction are called Los Mayos, who historically were loyal to Mayo Zambada, who was basically, on paper, you can make the argument, you can say he was the right-hand man of El Chapo. In reality, he was the most powerful drug lord in the Sinaloa cartel. I would make the argument more powerful than El Chapo himself. It was Mayo Zambada. The two factions are now in civil war, and the reason why is because Los Chapitos betrayed Mayo Zambada and managed to get him turned over to the U.S. in 2024. And the son of Mayo Zambada, a guy named Maito Flaco, took over the reins of the Mayos organization, and because of the betrayal of Los Chapitos, declared war against Los Chapitos, and now the Mayos and Chapitos are in active war that is mostly centered in Sinaloa, but we can also see in areas of Durango as well. And it's a very bloody civil war right now. It's so bloody that Los Chapitos actually formed an alliance with the Jalisco New Generation cartel to fight against the Mayos. But that's all inside of Mexico. What's very interesting is if you track the Sinaloa cartel outside of Mexico, if you look at their activities in the United States, if you're looking at their activities in Europe and Africa and Asia, there is not a civil war in Sinaloa cartel's international presence. It is confined inside of Mexico. And if you talk to Sinaloa cartel drug operatives and drug traffickers, and CNN did this actually, when they found members of the Sinaloa cartel that they interviewed, what they will tell you is that the civil war, the Sinaloa cartel civil war, is something only inside of Mexico. that the Sinaloa cartel operatives who've been dealing with drug trafficking for decades or years will say, we are not part of that fight. We want nothing to do with that fight. That is the problem for the guys in Mexico to figure out, but we still consider ourselves Sinaloa cartel, which is a very interesting dynamic that highlights that the cartel's international presence is not a violence motivator, or it's not even a territorial factor. It's just a transactional factor similar to what we saw in Mexico decades ago. And the violence of the Sinaloa cartel civil war is confined inside of Mexico and has not exported itself outside. And the irony of the situation is Los Chapitos have an alliance with Jalisco New Generation cartel. But what we have not seen is an integration of the Jalisco New Generation cartel drug model and drug trafficking model with the Chapitos drug trafficking model. Those still are separated. So the alliance is just a military alliance of the gunmen and the sicarios and the fighters inside of Mexico, not internationally. Which then opens up a lot of opportunities for law enforcement to see how can they exploit the violence that they're seeing inside of Mexico for law enforcement's perspectives and have a better understanding of what's going on. And how is it that the Sinaloa cartel civil war has not been seen in India, in China, in Europe, in Africa, where we know the Sinaloa cartel has a presence? And those open up a lot of lines of investigations that can be looked into to have a better understanding. But again, the cartel's international presence and reach is all dictated and surrounded by drug trafficking. And I do believe that what we're actually seeing now is a rebirth and a surge of cocaine. I know obviously a lot of us have been focusing on the methamphetamines and the synthetic drugs and the fentanyl. I do believe that the fentanyl piece caused a lot of political pressure from the United States because of the death that caused, and similarly with the synthetic drugs, that now what we're seeing is a surge of cocaine. And we see it in the United States, and we see it in Europe, and we see it in Australia, that the price of cocaine is actually going down in these countries because a lot of the cocaine that has been manufactured in South America are just being flooded internationally. And a lot of cartels are just going back to the true and proven method of using cocaine to generate income. Because the marijuana trade is now just produced and manufactured inside the United States. There's no necessity or requirement for an international drug trafficking organization to traffic marijuana if you could just produce it in the United States illegally, even with states that have legalized consumption of marijuana. So cocaine is the de facto method of what they do. And the thing about cocaine is there's only certain areas in the world where it's produced. And the cartels, from a logistical perspective and an export-import business, have that pretty solidly under their control through negotiations and deal with criminal organizations in South America and Colombia, specifically, such as FARC dissident groups, ELN, Clan del Golfo, etc. And because they have that control, they also now manage the import-export businesses as well, and either do that in-house internally or leverage third parties to do it for them, and they just manage the expenses to do it. And I think the future of what we're going to see, at least for the remainder of 2026, if I may say, is going to be predominantly a lot more of the cocaine, and the synthetic drugs are also going to continue to go up. But one of the key differentiating factors that I would focus on is this idea of cartel members actually trying to manufacture synthetic drugs in the country where they're located without being so reliant on a lot of exports from other countries, specifically precursors. They're going to try to do everything in-house because we're already seeing that specifically in Europe, but we already have case studies of that in India and Kenya as well. So that's kind of the aspects that I would highlight just in summary. Cartels in Europe, Asia, and Africa are profit-motivated, transactional only. That is the only thing they care about or are interested in. We do not see inherently the violence inside of Mexico even get exported to these other countries. Even into the United States, we haven't seen that. And with the case example of the Sinaloa cartel civil war, we haven't seen that export to other countries. And so I think that's the key aspect. And I truly believe that cocaine is going to be the primary drug trafficking for the remainder of 2026, as it was in 2025, and the introduction and production of synthetic drug labs in these other countries. And with that, I'll stand by in case there's any questions, but thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for your time. We really learned a lot from you, sir. And it was very insightful. The details we shared about the transnational syndicates. Thank you so much. So here we conclude the session for today. It's 9:30 p.m. in India, and we are very sorry that we couldn't take the question and answer session today. But if anyone from the audience have questions, you can email to Intake Research Forum No matter who you are addressing your question to, Indic Research Forum will direct your question to the respective speaker and will get your answer from them. And now I will request all our speakers to give one concluding remark for today. Can I request Jay sir? Jay sir, can we start with you? Can you give the concluding remarks for today? Mike sir, can you give the concluding remarks for today?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the question.
I'll say, Hriday, just a second. We can request all the speakers to kindly deliver their concluding remarks. And with this, we'll wind up the session. So I think we can start with Mike. Mr. Mike, if you can deliver your concluding remarks for this session, and then we can proceed to the other speakers.
Thank you very much. Okay, first of all, again, I'd like to reiterate and echo my colleagues' comments about how important this forum is and how I appreciate the invitation to participate. I think the last speaker, Mr. Stefano Rittendale, is that correct pronunciation?
That's correct. Thank you, sir.
Was spot on with his assessment of things in Mexico. I absolutely agree with the current models in Mexico. And again, I do believe that we have to unite and as best as possible, follow the money. I think that's key in having an impact. Certainly these cartels have established their own sophisticated means of operating, and they operate with the principal tool of violence. Ever since the Zetas were created, they've all carried on that same model of highly elite, specially trained in communications, logistics, explosives, operational tactics. It's difficult for the Mexican government to attack that. You know, I encourage more of what we're doing right now to try to, you know, at least get on the same sheet of music. I think that's very important, and I appreciate you all hosting this, and congratulations.
Thank you so much, Mike sir. Can I ask Stefano sir to give his concluding remarks?
No, just to repeat, this is a very complex issue that I think sometimes tries to get oversimplified. So I really appreciate the Indic Research Forum by really trying to get a lot of the experts in the field that I've tracked their work for a long time to try to give you the best understanding possible in a very complex problem set. I think this was a great discussion. It was a true honor for having me here today. And I'm also very excited to join you guys as well tomorrow. So thank you to everybody, and thank you to the Indic Researchers Forum for this opportunity to speak.
Thank you. Ms. Alba, ma'am, can you give your concluding remarks? Ma'am, you are on mute. You are on mute.
I have many trouble this for the connection is not good, but only say for you thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much for being present.
Can we have Dr.
I
Barry?
think,
Where is you?
yes, I'm isn't here. Just left. So, shall we conclude this session?
I think Mr. Margarito is also not here, or is he?
Yes. Yeah.
Mr. Margarito, if you're here, if you could kindly deliver your concluding remarks, and then we'll wind up the session. Okay, I think he's not here. So, Hriday, you can conclude.
So, thank you so much for your time, respected speakers and respected audience. Thank you so much for being here and enlightening the society. Thank you. And yes, for the audience, do join us tomorrow. There are more exciting and insightful sessions tomorrow as well. So please join us. And for the participants who want to take their certificate for the attendance, have to compulsory be present tomorrow. Thank you.